Real quickly, I want to, since we're on Elden Ring,
Hmm.
would you consider Elden Ring a JRPG?
I was seeing a conversation
Yeah.
going around the internet that JRPG is reductive. So
Yes.
I don't. Would I consider it a JRPG? No, I would consider it a Japanese RPG. JRPG in from the American perspective to me has always meant turn-based animated, like with like an animated style of some kind. Like I would say I've been playing a lot of Octopath Traveler 2 recently.
Hmm.
That's more JRPG than Elden Ring, for
Yeah.
example. Your Octopaths, your Personas, your old Final Fantasies. But yeah, I guess there's a conversation going around in the industry right now that we need to retire the term JRPG.
Yeah, so the origins of it, I'll draw from this Kotaku article just to extrapolate better. There was recently an interview with Final Fantasy 16 producer, what's his name again? Naoki Yoshida. Specifically, I'll read the title of the article. I sent it in the chat if you wanted to look it up. Final Fantasy 16 producer doesn't seem to love the term JRPG. Producer Naoki Yoshida said he considered the game genre term discriminatory when it first gained traction. Final Fantasy 16 producer Naoki Yoshida, aka Yoshi P, revealed in a recent interview that he and other developers in Japan didn't like the popular term JRPG when it first popped up years ago, thinking it was discriminatory or being used to make fun of, quote, make fun of, unquote, Japanese developers working on games like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. So I watched X Play back in the day. I think I've mentioned it before. It was on G4. It was like the premier gaming television show, really the only one that I was familiar with being on the air. And it makes sense when you go back and I completely wiped it from my brain, but when you go back and see how they covered JRPGs, man, they just like it was just instantaneously like skepticism and would shit on it just instantly, and they
Hmm.
tie that in to it being a JRPG, like, oh, it's a JRPG, so it has this bad thing and this bad thing, and you basically just use it as a way to bring up criticisms of games, but use that to brand it and just JRPGs are bad, and they did that a lot. So I was it makes sense that they had that much of an issue with the
Yeah.
term because apparently it wasn't even just XPlay. That was my premier way of getting video game news. That was seemingly an industry standard at the time to just kind of wave aside JRPGs just because they had the moniker JRPG because they were RPGs made in Japan. And that's not even including the fact that JRPGs are kind of a broad way to define RPG games made in Japan. It limited things. So let me see if they include the bit. Let me see if they for us quote for us as developers in Japan. The first time we heard it, it was like a discriminatory term, explained Yoshida, as though we were being made fun of for creating these games. And for some developers, the term JRPG can be something that will maybe trigger bad feelings because of what it was in the past. It wasn't a compliment to a lot of developers in Japan. We understand that recently JRPG has better connotations and it's being used as a positive, but we still remember the time it was used as a negative. And it's good we came away from that.
Yeah, and when you just break it down and think about it, it's weird. Like, because especially in the times we live in where Japanese RPGs aren't necessarily your idealized JRPG, kind of sort of what I described as like your turn-based, maybe a little more animated, maybe a little more just Japanese culturally. Like Elden Ring is a great example. That's a Japanese game. It's a role-playing game, but it wouldn't fit under the umbrella of JRPG. Um, like maybe a Persona would. Final Fantasy. It's been a long time since Final Fantasy has been a traditional quote unquote JRPG. So really, what are we talking about when the JRPG franchise is not fitting under that umbrella anymore? It might be time to retire that moniker because because genres as a whole have diversified, specifically in the RPG, where every single game has RPG elements these days. All of them do. Like it's just sort of like a thing that happens to the point to where like even The Last of Us Part 2 has some like RPG mechanics if you really want to like break it down and get granular with it. So like what is an RPG anymore has kind of been diversified and it's a little harder to put your thumb on the pulse of it. But I've never understood why we have that classification tied to a nationality, tied to an ethnicity, tied to a culture when we could just find better words for it. We all know what a tactics RPG is. you know, where, you know, you look at your triangle strategies, you look at your Final Fantasy tactics, you look at your Fire Emblems, and, you know, that makes sense. So maybe we just need to embrace turn-based RPG. Maybe we need to find a new term for that type of RPG. And it's an interesting conversation that I appreciated happening in the culture, in the industry this last week, where I was like, oh, that's actually interesting. I wonder if, you know, he mentions in this article here, he goes, listen, I know that like now it's not so much like a bad thing, but like a lot of us remember when it was.
Yeah.
Like, and it was kind of insulting.
And it makes sense. I wouldn't like to just be, put into this box that's extremely broad and just used as a vehicle for criticism. I never myself really thought about JRPGs aside from like, oh, they're games made out of Japan that have certain elements, like you said, turn-based, maybe a bit more, they have the cinematic elements to it, maybe a more anime style. But overall, it was really just kind of a, this is a JRPG and that's a JRPG, and they could be two completely different games that you could be calling a JRPG. So, I don't know what would be, I guess we can all just call it RPGs in general now, or maybe come up with a term to compartmentalize certain JRPG games that have, differing characteristics.
Well, it all fits under the umbrella of RPG, but that umbrella is so large now that we just need subgenres for this. Like, I mean, you see it all the time in like action games or, action adventure games or real-time strategy versus like just strategy games, you know what I'm saying? So like it's just a I suppose a bookmark, it's a benchmark in video game evolution to where it's just like, oh, this is what is sort of demanded because the culture is moving forward from here. And the medium is diversifying.
Yeah, well, I don't think we're in the position to be able to say that this is the new term that it'll be called, but we can try and find something.